So, I'm sick. So you'll have to excuse whatever's going on here. My baby's being bad, but I've been stuck home for 2 days, so I just kind of wanted to get cozy and tell a scary story. So I got some tea. I'm going to tell you one of my favorite true stories of the paranormal, the lost children of the Alleghenies. Our story begins in the Allegheny Mountains, which are one part of the vast Appalachian mountain range. The Alleghenies specifically stretch from Pennsylvania to West Virginia. Oh my god. Well, we got a new set piece here. This is very bad. I gave her some catnip to try to keep her out of my hair, so now she's just juiced up on catnip. She's like vibrating up there and staring at me. I'm terrified. I'm scared for my life. So, while the Alleghenies were once home to thriving Native American cultures, for European settlers, the mountain range was kind of a barrier to westward expansion. Unfortunately, that barrier couldn't hold forever, and by the late 18th century, European settlers had started to make their homes in the Allegheny Mountains. One such family was that of Samuel and Susanna Cox, who in 1856 lived in a log cabin in an area known as Spruce Hollow, an area that sits in the rugged and still isolated pocket between Allegheny Front and Blue Knob. Samuel and Susanna had 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. On the morning of April 24th, 1856, the family was finishing breakfast when they heard the sound of their family dog barking outside. Assuming his dog was alerting to a squirrel or some other form of prey, Samuel took up his rifle and headed out of the cabin. No one knows quite what happened next. Susanna and the girls were distracted, but at some point, the Cox's 2 sons left the safety of their remote cabin and trekked out into the dangerous forest. The boys were George and Joseph, 7 and 5 years old, respectively. Some speculate that the boys may have intended to follow their father, eager to help him hunt for their dinner. Others wonder if someone, or something, drew the boys out into the trees, calling out to them, luring them away into the ancient wilderness. Whatever the case, Susanna didn't immediately assume her sons were missing. When she noticed them gone, she assumed that they'd gone with their father. But when Samuel returned without the boys, the couple realized that they must have gone out into the forest alone, and they immediately began a panicked search for their lost children. And even though it was broad daylight, the forest was so thick that it was dark between the trees. And even though it was late April, the winter frost still held on strong. But it wasn't just the cold or the dense terrain that made the woods so dangerous. The wilds were full of predators, panthers and bears and bobcats and even wolves. And of course, there was the most dangerous predator of all, man. Despite how isolated they were, the Coxes managed to notify nearby settlers of their plight, and by nightfall, volunteers came from all over to help in the search for the missing boys. It's said that every able-bodied man in the region dropped what they were doing and came to assist. And that night, the searchers combed for miles around the Cox cabin, bearing torches and calling out for the boys. It was believed that if the boys were out there, they'd see the light from the fires and hear all the voices calling out to them. But on the first night, no trace of the boys was found. Day by day, the search expanded. Volunteers came from up to 50 miles away, which in 1856, that was kind of a big deal. Over 2,000 people joined in the hunt for the missing children. But after days of searching, nothing was ever found. The family even called upon the help of a reputed witch to help search for their sons. The Alleghenies and the Appalachians as a whole have a rich history of folk magic practices, and the witches of the area were equally respected as they were feared, seen as providing an essential service, everything from curse breaking to herbal medicine. But after 2 days of wandering the woods, even the witch couldn't find the Cox's missing children. Eventually, it was decided that there was no way that the boys were going to be found alive. The temperatures were too cold, and there was no way that the boys could have gone beyond the search radius. They would have had to cross the swollen river, which was flooded with melting snow waters. And so, of course, people began to talk. I just spilled tea on myself. There were some who assumed that the boys had been dragged off by a bear or a mountain lion, and that their bodies would never be found. Others blamed the usual suspects: social outcasts, Native Americans, even a band of gypsies was blamed for the children's disappearance. But one paranoid local started to spread the rumor that the Coxes themselves had murdered their sons. This bit of hot goss took on a life of its own, with some suggesting that they had eaten the boys over the long cold winter and were staging this whole disappearance as a cover-up, or that they'd killed the boys to solicit donations and sympathy from their neighbors. While the community began to turn on the Coxes, at one point even searching their home for remnants of the boys' bodies, a local man became fixated on the mystery of what had happened to the boys. Jacob Dibert, who lived about 15 miles from the Cox cabin, watched the goings-on from afar. He didn't participate in the search party, but about 10 days after the boys went missing, he remarked to his wife that he wished that he could know what really happened to them. He told her that he wished he could see the location of their bodies in a dream. And that night, when Jacob slept, he did indeed have a very strange dream. In his dream, Jacob traveled through unfamiliar woods. He crossed a stream on a fallen log and passed a dead deer and a child's shoe. And then Jacob saw the bodies of the two little boys lying at the foot of a broken birch tree. When Jacob awoke, he thought the dream was just a product of his imagination. He wasn't familiar with the terrain near the Cox cabin, and he assumed he just made it all up. But the next night, he had the exact same dream, only this time it was all clearer and more realistic. This time it was harder to shake. So when he had the same dream again for a third night in a row, Jacob awoke and told his wife about his vision. And his wife, being familiar with that area of Bedford County, felt that she recognized some of the landmarks that Jacob described from his dream. She encouraged Jacob to follow the clues he'd seen, and she enlisted the help of her brother, who accompanied Jacob into the woods of Spruce Hollow. And as they traced the trail from the Cox cabin, Jacob and his brother-in-law encountered all the landmarks from Jacob's dream: the fallen log across the stream, the dead deer, the child's shoe, and then, in the roots of a broken birch tree, they found the bodies of Joseph and George Cox. It was 13 days after the two boys had gone missing, and they were just beyond the swollen river that no one thought they could cross. Curiously, it was also noted that the tree that the boys were found under was the only birch tree in the area, and that it had a very unusual appearance. The trunk was bent and twisted, and the top of the tree was split, as if it had been hit by a bolt of lightning. The family was alerted that the children's remains were located, and the boys' bodies were examined for a cause of death. When no signs of trauma were found, it was assumed that they had died of exposure, and the boys' bodies were buried. Jacob Dibert used the reward money he was given to purchase a headstone for the boys' grave. On the 50th anniversary of the brothers' death, a monument was erected in the place where the boys were found, which still stands today in Pennsylvania's Blue Knob State Park, along with a plaque detailing the story and Jacob's prophetic dream that led to the location of the boys' bodies. But for the most part, the story ends there. The Cox's 3 daughters survived to adulthood, while Jacob went on to fight and die in the Civil War. Don't worry, he was fighting for the Union, so we can still like him. Jacob was a good guy. Or was he? Of course, one has to wonder if perhaps there is another reason why Jacob knew the location of the boys' bodies. If perhaps Jacob himself was the one to lure the boys from their cabin into the dark woods. It wouldn't be the first time that a killer inserted themselves into the investigation or pretended to be the one to find their victim's body. But allegedly, the boys showed no signs of physical trauma, though I don't exactly trust the 1856 Appalachian forensics to be able to turn up much. It's entirely possible that everyone just assumed their cause of death to be exposure, and the investigation into their cause of death was hardly more than a quick once-over. People had really intense hang-ups about dead bodies at this time, and it'd be a long time before autopsies and post-mortem forensics became a thing. So there's no way that anyone was going to be cutting into the bodies of these little boys. So would anyone have ever even looked closely enough to know if these boys were strangled to death or murdered some other way that didn't leave a bloody, gaping, obvious wound? But murder's boring. I like to think that something even stranger happened here. See, besides the known natural predators that roamed the Alleghenies at this time, there are stories of things unknown as well. It bears noting that the Appalachian Mountains are old, very old. So old, in fact, that the original mountain chain stretches all the way into Europe, becoming what is now known as the Scottish Highlands. That means that this mountain range was formed when Europe and the Americas were one continent, making the Appalachian Mountains even older than the Atlantic Ocean. And part of what made the region so popular for logging was the old trees there, some of them hundreds or even thousands of years old. And it would make sense in a forest so ancient that there might be things beyond our comprehension hiding in the vast wilderness. What did the barking dog see that drew Samuel Cox out into the woods that day? Why did the boys follow out into the forest? Were they going after their father? Or was something else out there? Something that led them far beyond the search area. Something that fed from them and left them amongst the twisted roots of a lightning-struck tree. Something that Jacob tapped into when he dreamt his prophetic dream that led him to the boys' bodies at the foot of that strange birch. I also wonder what's up with the dead deer. Like, could the boys have stumbled upon something that was mid-meal that then made the boys its dessert? And the lost shoe. If the boys had simply died of exposure, why would one of their shoes be lying nearby? It almost indicates a struggle, doesn't it? And I guess at this point, I could go into some of the strange folklore of the region, or talk about the Bigfoot sightings there, or even talk about the hags of the Scottish Highlands and Jenny Greenteeth, or the ghosts of the Alleghenies. But my favorite stories are the ones with no real ending, the ones where your imagination gets to run wild with the possibilities, where you can create your own worst nightmare out of the shadows between the lines. So why don't you tell me what you think happened to George and Joseph Cox in the Pennsylvania wilderness in 1856? As for me, I'm gonna curl back up on the couch and watch my favorite high strangest comfort show, Hellier, which, if you enjoyed the existential dread of discussing the ancient Appalachians, will probably appeal to you, so you should check it out. I'll include a link to the Planet Weird channel in the description, or you can search Hellier on Amazon Prime. Thank you for hanging out with me. I'm sorry if this whole video feels like a fever dream, but now you're right there with me. Good night, sweet ghoul.